There is something about Detroit in the 1970s that people who lived through it will never forget. The rumble of muscle cars, the unmistakable sound of Motown drifting from every radio, and the rhythm of a city built on chrome and steel. If someone lived through it, they know exactly what made Motor City different from anywhere else on Earth. This was a time when Detroit was still the undisputed capital of American manufacturing. The big three automakers employed hundreds of thousands. Families could buy houses, raise kids, and retire comfortably on a single factory paycheck. Motown Records was still producing hits that defined a generation. And the city was experiencing a profound transformation that would shape its future for decades to come. This was the decade that gave us the last of the great muscle cars, the first African-American mayor, and the beginning of changes that no one saw coming. The American dream was still alive in Detroit, but the ground was shifting beneath everyone's feet. Let's walk through what daily life actually felt like during that unforgettable decade. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it reveals how much has changed in just 50 years. Let's step into that world. Living in Detroit in the 1970s meant living in a city dominated by the automobile in ways that went far beyond just driving one. The entire economy, the culture, the very identity of the city revolved around the cars rolling off assembly lines in factories that stretched for miles. If someone worked in Detroit, there was a good chance they worked for General Motors, Ford, or Chrysler, or for one of the hundreds of suppliers that fed parts to the big three. The Rouge River plant alone employed tens of thousands of workers at its peak. These were good jobs, union jobs. Jobs that let a man with a high school diploma support a family of 5, buy a brick bungalow in Dearborn or Warren, and put a Pontiac in the driveway. The homes in Detroit's working-class neighborhoods had a distinctive look in the 1970s. Brick bungalows and modest 2-story houses lined streets with names that reflected the city's diverse heritage. Inside, the decor matched the era. Harvest gold appliances in the kitchen, avocado green shag carpeting in the living room, wood-paneled basement rec rooms where families gathered to watch the Tigers on television. These basement spaces were essential in Detroit, providing escape from humid summers and bitter winters alike. A finished basement meant a place for the kids to play, for Dad to have his workbench, for the family to gather around the television set. The television in a Detroit home in the 1970s was the center of family life. Most families had one set, a large console that sat prominently in the living room. There were only a handful of channels: WJBK, WXX, Y, Z, WD, WJ, and maybe a few others if the antenna was positioned right. The TV guide was essential. Families would plan their weeks around their favorite programs. Missing a show meant missing it entirely. There was no way to record anything. The car culture that made Detroit famous reached a crossroads in the 1970s. The muscle car era was fading. The 1973 oil crisis hit Detroit particularly hard because the city had built its entire identity around big engines and unlimited horsepower. When gas prices suddenly spiked and lines formed at service stations, families who had lived their entire lives around V8 power faced a shock they never anticipated. Suddenly, those enormous Buicks and Chryslers that got 8 miles to the gallon seemed like liabilities rather than status symbols. Japanese imports like Toyota and Datsun started appearing on Detroit streets, and that felt almost treasonous in a company town. Before we continue with the neighborhoods and the music that defined this remarkable era, if you are enjoying this journey through American history and want to explore more decades and places, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories about how Americans built the life we know today. But despite the challenges, Woodward Avenue remained sacred ground for car enthusiasts throughout the 1970s. This legendary strip, running north from downtown Detroit through the suburbs, had been the epicenter of American street racing since the 1950s. Even as the muscle car era wound down, serious racers still gathered at places like Ted's Drive-In and the Totem Pole. Cars that could run in the 10-second range commanded respect. Engineers from the Big Three would sometimes bring prototype engines out to Woodward late at night, testing new performance options against the locals before putting them into production. The street racing on Woodward had its own code of honor. You had to have your car set up for the street, not a pure race car hauled in by trailer. If someone showed up with something suspicious, they might get cruised down to Detroit and back on the interstate before anyone would race them. The neighborhoods of Detroit in the 1970s were communities in the truest sense. People knew their neighbors. Kids played outside until the streetlights came on. Front porches were social spaces where adults gathered on summer evenings to talk about work, politics, and sports. There were distinct ethnic enclaves throughout the city: Polish neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods, and African American neighborhoods that had developed their own vibrant culture and economy. The boundaries between these communities were often rigid, enforced by both custom and covenant. But within each neighborhood, there was a sense of belonging that many residents remember fondly. The demographic transformation of Detroit accelerated dramatically in the 1970s. The city had been losing white residents to the suburbs since the 1950s, but after the upheaval of 1967, this exodus intensified. 8 Mile Road became more than just a street. It became a dividing line between the city and its increasingly white suburbs. In 1973, Coleman Young was elected as Detroit's first African American mayor. His election represented both hope and acknowledgement of how much the city had changed. For African American residents, many of whom had come north during the Great Migration seeking better opportunities, Young's election felt like validation. For others, particularly those moving to places like Warren and Livonia, it represented something else entirely. The music coming out of Detroit in the 1970s remained some of the most influential in the country, even as the Motown empire itself was changing. Berry Gordy had moved Motown headquarters to Los Angeles in 1972, which felt like abandonment to many Detroiters. But the Motown sound had already shaped American music forever. The Supremes, the Temptations, Stevie Wonder, and Marvin Gaye made Detroit synonymous with soul music worldwide. In the 1970s, the music evolved. Marvin Gaye's What's Going On captured the social consciousness of the era. Stevie Wonder released Superstition and Signed, Sealed, Delivered. The Jackson 5 had become international sensations. Even though the Motown headquarters was gone, the sound it created still echoed from car radios and basement parties across the city. Sports in Detroit during the 1970s provided moments of joy in an otherwise challenging decade. The Tigers remained beloved, playing at Tiger Stadium on Michigan and Trumbull, though the glory days of 1968 were fading into memory. The 1972 Tigers made the playoffs before losing a heartbreaking series to Oakland. The magical 1976 season of Mark Friedrich, known as the Bird, gave fans something to celebrate. This rookie pitcher talked to the baseball and groomed the mound with his hands, and he became a national sensation. For one summer, Friedrich reminded Detroit that baseball could still be pure fun. The Lions, the Pistons, and the Red Wings struggled through most of the decade. The Red Wings in particular fell into a deep funk, missing the playoffs for 7 consecutive seasons after Gordie Howe retired in 1971. It was an unusual slump for what had been one of hockey's greatest franchises. Working in a Detroit auto plant in the 1970s meant good wages and good benefits, but the work itself was grueling. The assembly line demanded repetitive motion for 8 hours or more. The noise was constant. The heat in summer was oppressive. Workers developed their own culture within the factories, their own hierarchies, their own ways of getting through the day. The United Auto Workers Union had won significant gains in previous decades, including cost of living adjustments that protected against inflation. Health insurance and pensions were standard, but chronic layoffs plagued the industry, especially after the oil crisis revealed how vulnerable the Big Three were to foreign competition. A worker might be making good money one month and laid off the next, waiting for demand to pick back up. Shopping in Detroit in the 1970s still centered on the downtown department stores for many families. Hudson's remained an institution, its flagship store on Woodward Avenue, a cathedral of retail where families would make special trips, especially during the holiday season. The elaborate Christmas window displays drew crowds every year. But the malls were changing everything. Northland, which had opened in the 1950s as one of America's first regional shopping centers, remained popular. New malls were opening in the suburbs, drawing shoppers away from downtown. The neighborhood commercial strips that had anchored communities for generations were starting to struggle as chains replaced local businesses. Food in Detroit in the 1970s reflected the city's working-class, multicultural character. Coney Island restaurants served their distinctive chili dogs at all hours. Greek diners, Polish bakeries, Italian restaurants in the East Side neighborhoods. The American Coney Island and Lafayette Coney Island sat side by side downtown, their rivalry as old as anyone could remember. Families might splurge on Friday fish fry at the local parish hall or Saturday night dinner at one of the supper clubs that still dotted the suburbs. Fast food was spreading. McDonald's and Burger King were becoming ubiquitous. But for many Detroit families, home cooking remained the standard. Casseroles and pot roasts and whatever could stretch a grocery budget during times of layoff. The winters in Detroit shaped daily life in ways that people who have never lived through them cannot fully understand. Temperatures dropping well below zero. Lake effect snow piling up for days. Cars that needed to be plugged in overnight so they would start in the morning. The ritual of scraping ice from windshields before work. Children bundled in so many layers they could barely move. But Detroiters adapted. They had to. The factories did not close for weather. The assembly lines kept moving. Workers found ways to get there. The challenges Detroit faced in the 1970s were serious and would only deepen in the decades to come. Manufacturing jobs were beginning their long decline. The population was shrinking. The tax base was eroding. Crime was rising. The city government struggled to maintain services with diminishing resources. But for many who lived there, Detroit in the 1970s was still home. It was the place where they had grown up, where their families had built lives, where their parents had come seeking opportunity. The bonds of community, of shared experience, of memory, held people even as the world around them changed. What defined Detroit in the 1970s was this tension between what had been and what was coming. The city had been the arsenal of democracy during World War II. It had been the place where the American middle class was built, one paycheck at a time. It had been the center of American manufacturing and the birthplace of sounds that changed music forever. All of that was still present in the 1970s, still visible on every corner and audible in every factory. But the future was also visible for those who chose to look. The closed storefronts, the population decline, the competition from overseas. The city was at a crossroads, though not everyone knew which way the road would turn. For those who lived in Detroit during the 1970s, it was a time of muscle cars giving way to compacts, of Motown fading into memory, of factories that had seemed permanent beginning to show their age. It was a time of block parties and neighborhood pride, of union wages and basement rec rooms, of Tiger Stadium on summer nights and snow piling up on 8 Mile Road. The Detroit of the 1970s was not the Detroit of today, nor was it the Detroit of the 1950s. It was something in between, a city in transition, carrying the weight of its past while stumbling toward an uncertain future. For those with memories of this remarkable era in Motor City, there is always more history to explore. So,